I want to introduce you all to our conversation and our speakers today. We're really excited to have them with us and to share with you a little bit about some work that's happening with CARP Lab and our colleagues that study Scandology. So as you all know and saw us write about a little bit as we were promoting this webinar, scandals and character assassination have a lot in common. So we're excited to bring these two fields of research into some more direct conversation. Both scandals and character assassination circulate extensively through our media climate. So CARP Lab is excited to announce and welcome the Scandalogy Research Initiative as a partner in our research, and you'll hear more about what that means in a second here. I know a lot of you all have worked with and attended some of our conferences hosted by CARP Lab, the Lab for Research in Character Assassination and Reputation Politics. And we have a number of you on the call today that contributed to the first volume that we at CARP Lab put out, the Routledge Handbook of Character Assassination and Reputation Management, which was edited by me and the co-founders of the CARP Lab. So I guess now is a great time for me to tell you I'm Jennifer Cohane, one of the co-founders of CARP Lab and an assistant professor at the University of Baltimore. I'm joined on our call today by Sergey Samulenko and Eric Sharive from George Mason University, also co-founders of CARP, and Martin Ix from the University of Amsterdam, one of the co-founders of CARP as well. Thank you for your strong waves there, gentlemen. Together, we also recently put out the Character Assassination and Reputation Management volume, Theory and Applications, which is designed to be a primer on character assassination. It's designed really for use in a classroom setting, but is a really good overview of the different arenas in which character assassination happens. And as a result, I think would be of interest to many of you who are dipping your toe into this topic or want to learn more. Now, I want to introduce you then to the Scandalogy Research Initiative, and together our representatives from this initiative, Hendrik and André, have built frameworks to study scandals and their history in our global media environment and its antecedents. They love to take a historical perspective as well, which resonates with us at CARP too. They have held 3 international conferences on Scandology, and so we can see the very first one, some photos there that they have shared with us kicking off, and you'll recognize these two faces as well. CARP co-founders Eric and Martin presenting at one of the Scandalogy conferences, asking the question, why do some character attacks cause scandals and others do not? And together, the Scandalogy Research Initiative has put out 3 volumes exploring this topic. I actually really love the cover of these books, like bold announcement of a new field of research. And they're actually going to put together a conference that will happen in Germany in 2022, this fall, exploring political scandals in the age of populism, partisanship, and polarization. You love to see the alliteration there. So we are excited to welcome them and have our conversation with these august scholars today. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we jump in. We hope to make our time together like a conversation. So if you have comments or questions, please do type them into the chat and we will try to address them as we go along, but we've definitely also saved some time for questions at the end of our time today. So we have our CARP Lab colleagues monitoring the chat and will help advance the conversation with some of your comments as well. That said, I would ask that you please stay muted so that we try to minimize background noise so that we can share this conversation with some of the other folks that we work with at CARP Lab and with the Scandalogy Research Initiative as well. So to that end, I feel like we should tell you we are recording this conversation. If that changes how you wish to interact with us, so be it. But we are very much looking forward to this conversation. So let's do it, y'all, shall we? I guess maybe since I did our introduction so briefly, André and Hendrik, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Yeah, and first of all, thank you for the kind introduction, Jenny. We're really happy that we got this set up. It was in the making for quite a bit. I mean, we met Martin and Eric 2018 at our second conference, yeah, hosted here at the University of Bamberg. That's where I am a research assistant since 2012 already. And long time, one of my colleagues was André. And André, you left a couple of years to the University of Kufstein, where you're an assistant professor in communications and marketing.
Marketing, communication management, and digital marketing. And yeah, we were working together for 7 years. I also joined University of Bamberg in 2012 and left in 2019 when I got the professorship. But we have a linkage, of course, with Scandology, and we are working together closely. For instance, in last year, we presented a paper on a comparative framework to study scandals in international contexts at the ICRIA Polcom conference. So we try to stick together and build this Scandology network up a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and broaden our international and interdisciplinary ties as well. And I think our webinar today is great testament to this, right? I mean, it's amazing how many people actually agreed or made time to tune in after myriads of Zoom meetings in the past 2 years. I mean, it's quite astonishing. And thank you all for being here, really, and joining us in this conversation about scandals and the merits of scandal research in a global media system.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes. Yes. So grateful to so many of you. It's always nice when folks actually want to come and hear the conversation that you have spent a long time planning. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I suspect that many folks probably haven't thought about studying scandal as sort of an academic type of discipline. Obviously, scandals happen all the time, and we may sort of operate under an I know it when I see it type of framework. But from your perspective as researchers, what actually is a scandal? What are the characteristics of scandals?
Now there is one definition which is quite common in the field of scandals and reputation management. A scandal is a three-step process. First, you need a transgression of norms, for example, moral codes or laws. It hasn't got to be a legal breach. It can also be a transgression of a moral institution or a moral code. For example, don't swear in the public. That's the first step. In the next step, this transgression has to be made public, or it is done in public. For example, when you look at talk scandals where politicians or celebrities say something controversial, which might happen on live television, then we also have a transgression happening live in public. And the third step is probably the most important one. You need some outrage, at least in parts of the public. What we're witnessing now in the last years is, as Hans-Matthias Keplinger said at one conference, that these smaller scandals are happening much more often today, because small publics can articulate their outrage via, for instance, social media, which wasn't possible in the 1970s or 80s or 90s. There you needed the power of mass media to articulate your outrage, and this has changed.
So yeah, André, let me just add, my idea of scandals is really, I mean, first of all, I totally agree with this three-step definition, and most important is here really the emotional outrage, the public outrage, or also the discursive negotiation of consequences here. So from this point of departure, one could also argue, I think, that scandals are somewhat an essential part of human culture. Some stable communicative pattern that cultures function by, or cultures work by. And I think scandals, and this is what the historical perspective really teaches us, scandals can really be traced anywhere in recorded culture and its collection of material artifacts, I think. So scandals have always given social groups communicative means in the three-step model that André presented to effectively mediate actions that involve the breaching of moral codes or just acceptable behavior. And scandals help to determine how to elicit a sufficient response, a sufficient public response to this, and determine how through discursive means such a transgression can be negotiated, a transgression that would, I think, otherwise endanger social peace as well. And this relates back to this functionalist perspective, that scandals are really something that are essentially keeping societies stable. We need scandals. I mean, even though from our everyday perspective, we might be overfed by them, and we rather see scandals as something that deteriorates culture and societies. But again, there's also this perspective proliferated by Hans Matthias Keplinger or Karl Otto Honrich, for instance, to a degree at least, that scandals stabilize cultures and societies.
That's really interesting to think about scandals as a way to stabilize culture. But one of the things that I think your definition of scandals really points us to is some overlaps between scandals and character assassination, right? You point to public outrage as a really important aspect of a scandal. And we at CARP Lab have also written about the audience as the most important arbiter of whether a character attack is successful. Likewise, the idea that scandals exist in every culture and time period that you all have studied mirrors our examination of character assassination throughout history as well. We found character attacks in every culture and historical era that we have studied as well. So a really foundational part of human competition from our perspective is character assassination, and the idea of scandals as sort of a universal negotiation of the norms of culture really, I think, points to the significance of doing this research. But maybe to follow that thread a little bit more, you know, it's starting to become clear, hopefully, to the folks on the call that this is really foundational to human society. So what got you all interested in studying scandals, and what types of scholarly influences? Maybe we can do the scholarly thing fast, since that's not always as interesting to that many people. But what got you interested in studying scandals in the first place?
To be honest, another pillar of human society, namely leisure time. We got together after work, and we, over a couple of drinks, we discussed really scandals that were going on back in the day. I think it was the Gutenberg plagiarism scandal back then that really got us thinking as early PhD students as well about the norms and conduct of scientific work, really. And we were just freely discussing what was going on in politics. And from this perspective, I mean, from this perspective that scandals are kind of ubiquitous, right? They're everywhere. They permeate our everyday life, and they are somewhat linked to gossip as well. So we were just like exchanging what we thought about it, because that's another thing I think about scandals. As they evoke a public response or an emotional response, so to speak, it's something, talking about scandals really gets people, and got us reflecting on politics, right? It's and that's not something that is exclusive to the academic perspective. There's a really nice study by historian Frank Bösch, published a couple of years back in one of the leading scholarly journals in Germany, Publizistik, where he analyzed how the working class, what the working class in the German Empire before the First World War was discussing in bars over beers and so on and so forth. And he analyzed the transcript of secret police that were listening in on those working class conversations back then. And what he really discovered is that the working class was really attuned to what was going on politically in the German Empire, and they discussed what was going on politically mainly through the scandals of the day back then. Yeah, so that is really interesting, and links to Mai's and André's perspective here, that really scandals are an entryway into the political sphere. And even though one might not be so attuned to the abstract aspects of political topics or political issues, scandals kind of make this graspable or more graspable, because again, as I said, the transgressions within the political systems are made visible and made understandable, and are communicated through scandals, really. So that was one of the starting points for us.
And what we also found out is the massive impact of some hard scandals. We're not talking about the gossip ones, the soft scandals about celebrities, or I don't know, the hard scandals where laws were broken, for example. And there's one scandal of interest for me. It is the CDU donation scandal. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, his downfall after it became clear that he was involved in some way, and this led to the rise of Angela Merkel and to a completely new party culture, a completely new culture of the conservatives in Germany. So you can see such a massive scandal can influence the future of politics, for example, if it is a political scandal, for instance. This is really, really interesting. And speaking about academic influences, we have lots of colleagues working on scandals, but of course there's some major experts. For example, Christina Holz-Boscher, she's here today, hello, and also Stefan Burkhardt from Hamburg, or Hans-Matthias Keplinger, University of Mainz, John Thompson, of course, and Bob Entman, which was also a guest at our first conference, a keynote speaker. We were very happy and proud about that. Really inspiring talks with him. In our first book, we had an interview with him. Hendrik did an interview via email. This was a new way of communicating scientific insights, but it was really interesting, and lots of people were happy to read such a format and not only a paper after paper. So we tried to open this in a new kind of way. And yeah, I was also studying scandals in my dissertation. I changed the perspective a little bit, because what I witnessed was a lot of politicians or parties, especially in the populist sphere, use scandals or provocations to promote themselves and their positions and their topics. I called it intentional self-scandalization. And of course, after I wrote the book, I couldn't see the word scandal for 1 or 2 years. You may witness the same thing, I think. And then I talked to Hendrik, and we talked again about scandals, and then this was the starting point of the whole initiative.
There's something so perfect, by the way, about you all meeting over beer to discuss scandals. And as Sergey pointed out in the chat, that's how the CARP co-founders got started as well. I remember back when I was working at George Mason University, conversations over beer in the union there. And those were important conversations for us. But I think that's funny, because that's also a parallel then to thinking about, the history of Germany and folks meeting over beer in the pub to discuss the scandals of the day as an entry point to political conversations and that kind of thing. Sort of the flip of, the salons and the public sphere that Habermas wrote about, for instance, where we would get together to discuss the issues of the day in sort of a fancy, educated way, but still just as important for an entry point into politics. Excellent. So you've already mentioned a couple of different ways of understanding scandals. I've heard André mention talk scandals, hard scandals, soft scandals, sort of these intentionally created scandals. So it's clear to me then that you all have different types of scandals that you study and a way to classify scandals. Can you tell us more about that, the different types?
There are some very, very famous models, of course. John B. Thompson differentiates between, for instance, political scandal and some subtypes like sex scandals, financial scandals. This is interesting and absolutely useful, but what we found or find more interesting are scandal phases to study recent scandals, for example, in which phase the scandalized person is. For example, Stefan Burkhardt proposed a scandal clock consisting of some phases until the climax hits in. For example, the politician resigns, yeah, or there's a lawsuit against him or her. And afterwards, there's this huge phase of rehab. This is also very, very interesting. If you look at scandalized people, politicians, for instance, scandalized years before, where are they now? This is an interesting question. If they are back in office or in a similar office, they did their rehab, for example. So this is really interesting concerning the scandal phases. Of course, we have other models or categories, for example, effects of scandals on the macro level, the whole society or social subsystem, on the meso level, on an organization, and then we are near crisis communication, of course, applied crisis communication, and at least the individual sphere, not only of the scandalized player or actor, but also of the recipients. We had some interesting studies in our books by Monica, for example. She's also here today. Hello. About the psychological or socio-psychological effects of scandals. This is also very interesting.
So I totally have to second what André is saying, right? So this is a good starting point, because especially Stefan Burkhardt's scandal clock shows us that there are, or at least hints at the fact that there seems to be a stable pattern by which all scandals kind of operate or roll out, so to speak. Yeah, so there's something is uncovered, then some people take notice of that, and the more people take notice, it's like an avalanche that gets rolling, right? And then public outrage is sparked, and there is an intensifying phase of really communication. And then it's not just public communication, but it also kind of triggers down to those encounter publics like us speaking in a bar or something like that, right? And what it also illustrates, and André hinted at that as well, is that there are specific roles assigned in a scandal, not just the scandalizer and the scandalized, but sometimes even literary roles like the fallen hero or something like that, the redeemed hero. So scandals sometimes have a redemption arc and those kind of things. And I think what is really interesting here is, and that's something we really mapped out in our first conference, is that research of scandals really can benefit from looking at this phenomenon from an interdisciplinary perspective. So, for instance, at the first conference, we also took the literary or the literary perspective into account as well, and we had a very interesting keynote by a professor in German studies, Martina Wagner-Egelhoff, who then presented specific, like a narratological concept to scandal research. What I'm getting here is that from this perspective, there is a stable pattern that constitutes scandals. And what André also mentioned is that we need a larger framework, kind of a context that makes us understand how scandals kind of take their own dynamic in specific times and places, for instance, right? Because what we really have to acknowledge, and I think this goes for scandal research or scandalogy and for character assassination, is that when we do case study research, Scandal A, character assassination, exhibit A, yeah, we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. So what we need is some kind of model to discover similarities and really get some kind of explanation from why there is a specific dynamic that shows commonalities, or why there are sometimes differences in how specific actions evoke scandals or don't evoke scandals, or some character assassinations have direct consequences and others don't. So by doing case studies, you get some kind of a corpus, but to analyze this corpus systematically, you need to establish a kind of a framework, right? And that's really what we want to get at here.
I'm going to go rogue for a second here and actually pop over to Martin's question in the chat, because it relates directly to what you were talking about in terms of thinking about a broader framework for understanding scandals. And, you know, it seems worthy to note, as you mentioned, that our approach to character assassination is quite similar. We drive a lot of our research by case studies and then trying to understand a broader framework for what's happening in those case studies, of course, which is culturally and historically specific. But so Martin's asking about the scandal clock, and the scandal clock of, you know, when people start to notice and when things trickle down. Does that apply to historical examples of scandals, or is it really tied to a modern mass media culture?
I'd say it's a universal model. The channels changed, of course. For instance, if we have a scandal in a medieval village, for example, in Europe, it gets public, people speak about it, more people speak about it, then there is a trial, I think, or there would have been a trial where the scandalized person is in front of a courtroom, for example, or in front of a powerful man, and then the rehabilitation, the rehab phase sets in. Of course, it's another level today if you look at the mass media system and the hybrid media system, at least with digital channels. That's a completely new universe. But I think that the scandal clock can also be applied to historic cases.
Yeah, so that indicates that the underlying dynamics have a lot in common.
I think so. I think so too. I mean, we had this interesting study on early modern sermons in the 15th century in our last collected volume, and there we have the same kind of process, right? I mean, we have a scandal that is made public, or a scandalization at least that is started, and then we have this kind of intensifying media coverage, obviously not by our modern standards, but if we look at pamphlet culture in the 15th and 16th century, I mean, we have the same phase of intensifying communication. And Martin, you're the expert here, or Florian, you as well. I'm sure to a degree the same is true for ancient cultures, right?
Yes,
and it
I would
depends
say so.
on the it depends on the political system. Lai just wrote in the chat that scandals do not shock anymore in some places in the world where freedom, democracy, law and order are not high on the political agenda. Of course, some authors wrote about scandals in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, and there are scandals, but these are show trials against opponents. That not real scandals.
Artificial scandals.
Yeah, show trials, like we see after some time we see such show trials in China, for example, or Russia. So it's not a normal scandal, of course, because we don't have free media. So maybe that's would be an argument not against the scandal clock applying to historical contexts, but we have to look at the context during that time.
Excellent. We've done a lot of work as well on thinking about how character assassination plays out in authoritarian versus democratic regimes, and the role of a media or a press that can check power is really central there. There are other great questions in the chat that I have bookmarked and I'm going to come back to later. But I want to ask, you know, thinking about the way that things have changed and the idea of a global media culture. And this is a question that we get asked a lot as scholars of character assassination, like, man, things are pretty awful now, right? And so I guess I'm curious, are we living in an age of perpetual scandalization? And we can sort of consider this question, I think, in the context of the comment in the chat that maybe folks are harder to shock now than they used to be, as norms about law and order, at least in some places, seem to have relaxed. So are we living in an age of perpetual scandals?
Let me counter that by saying people are less shocked now than they were before. I mean, think of environmental scandals. Yeah, today everybody would be outraged and shocked about the environmental damage or pollution in rivers and in the fields. And just think of Rachel Carson, A Silent Spring, right? People would be totally shocked, devastated today. The impact those revelations had 50 years ago was much smaller. I mean, I always remember this interesting anecdote by Hans Matthias Keplinger, who talks a lot about environmental scandals in the 60s and 70s, the pollution of the River Rhine, for instance. And then he says, well, I still went swimming in the Rhine. I didn't care like that. So really, this assumption that maybe it shocks differently, right? And on the other hand, I think a reason why we have the feeling that scandals are so ubiquitous, every day is a new scandal, is obviously due to the transformations of our media system and the oversaturation of information, the flow of information, and also the high choice media environments we live in, right? I mean, again, drawing from the historical perspective, the choices in media channels and where we receive information has exponentially grown in the last 20 or 30 years, right? But on the same time, at the same time, I think something happened also to how we as societies, or in Western societies in particular, see a transformation of our norms and values and a reflective process going on right now. And that obviously, when those norms, values, and moral codes get kind of more transparent or erosive, maybe, that is obviously a time and place where a lot more scandals can be triggered, right? And obviously,
I would add, yeah.
André.
Excuse me, and I would add, I mentioned before concerning the digital channels, especially the social web. With the advent of the social web, we see much more smaller scandals, or yeah, so to speak, scandals triggering smaller publics. It's another interesting observation, I think. There was every single day you see smaller scandals discussed on Twitter, for example. Yeah. There is no day without such a soft scandal. Yeah.
Yeah, and often, I mean, Scandinavian colleagues of ours call them talk scandals. Yeah, usually those kind of scandals are just somebody speaks in public or in a semi-public setting and they misspeak or something. Yeah, they say something that could be considered a bit unreflective or stupid. But what we're living through today is obviously a culture where everything is on record. And that makes people really, or that makes the threshold for a public outrage obviously much lower, because if something is recorded and shared through social media, it can meet an audience or a receptive audience that is willing to be outraged and willing to scandalize something. And that then may begin this phase of intensifying scandalization. That happens on a more frequent basis due to the transformative potential of social media, obviously, how it changes public communication as well. I mean,
yeah, I really appreciate the point that there certainly are things that we're outraged about now that we wouldn't have been outraged about in the past, right? And so the environmental example, I think, is a really good one, that, you know, allegations of pollution by a big company would not have caused a scandal, or that kind of thing. And, you know, simply put, those things today are things that we are scandalized by. And Martin raised the question, or added the comment too, things like racism and sexual harassment in the form of the Me Too movement are things that we are now justifiably so outraged by, but would not have caused scandals in the past. Again, great questions in the chat that we're going to come back to, but I'm curious, you know, André, you've mentioned the idea of small scandals that ripple through publics. And I'm curious what scandals you're paying attention to now. Are there recent scandals that are bubbling through our media environments that have caught your attention?
Yeah, before our seminar, I just worked on some data I collected on Twitter, you know, Twitter research. always an interesting thing. There was a scandal about a young journalist. Her name is Anna Dobler, a famous journalist in Austria, working for Yellow Press online platform. And two weeks before, she tweeted a post after a TV show in Germany. The TV show was about the Wannsee conference, where the Nazis discussed the final solution. And her tweet was about, she was speaking about that the Nazis were not only murderers, but also socialists. So she tried to make this connect between socialism and fascism or National Socialism, which was hugely discussed in the next hours, especially on the next day. I just saw the data on January 24th. She posted the tweet, and the next day Twitter was running wild, and she got fired the next day. And this was announced via Twitter by her editors-in-chief. So this is an interesting case because it showed that how fast such a transgression can reach the climax. Yeah, the tweet of the chief editors-in-chief, and how fast a scandalous opinion or a scandalous post can lead to an online firestorm. This is so interesting, and this is one of the most recent cases I'm interested in.
Anything catching your attention, Hendrik? Not to put you on the spot, but
yeah, no, sure. Well, what I found interesting is this ongoing scandal at Springer Media. A while back, I mean, I think that gained global attention as well. I mean, the chief editor had to resign, and that was due to a expose by the New York Times, actually. And recently, the Financial Times, also a very reputable international source, covered the way that the Springer CEO, Matthias Döpfner, dealt with this whole, I mean, it was sexual harassment. It was just the way that the editor-in-chief, Julian Reichelt, kind of used his power at in the newsroom or at the Bild Zeitung in particular to take advantage of younger female colleagues, for instance, and how this was kind of tolerated by the publishing house for a long time, and this has become this has gained more public attention now in the recent days, and I think this is interesting, similar to the Dobler scandal. Yeah. The Dobler scandal, the young journalist André just referred to, that's kind of a talk scandal. Yeah, she communicated something in the setting of social media, wanted to be provocative, maybe polarize a bit, as it is the media logic of Twitter or social media in general. And then obviously that garnered some kind of engagement that maybe she didn't anticipate, or consequences she didn't anticipate. Yeah, and that is a scandal that is very particular to the culture in German-speaking countries. I don't think she would have had to resign in the United States, for instance, for a similar statement. With the Bild Zeitung, it's somewhat different. I think it makes such high waves because our corporate culture is more and more geared up towards standards that have been cultivated in the United States or the Anglo-Saxon world in recent years. And I think the Bild Zeitung scandal wouldn't have had that much attention maybe 10 years ago in Germany, if at all, right? So here we see that cultural variables or cultural factors highly influence the dynamics a scandalization process takes, and the threshold or the likelihood that somebody can be redeemed even after transgressing some major moral or legal boundaries even. So that again is one of the points, or those two cases actually exemplify why we need this kind of heuristic framework or model that takes into account political culture, cultural settings, cultural history, national identity, all those kind of things. Yeah, the legal system, the media system, obviously as well, right?
Excellent. I want to come back to the question of context, since we've gotten a question about that in the chat. But I'm going to exercise moderator privilege and actually ask one last question before we turn to some of the great questions that you all have raised. And the question that I want to ask, we've talked about it maybe obliquely throughout our conversation, but what is the relationship between character assassination and scandals? Can scandals prompt character assassination? Can character assassination prompt scandals? What is that relationship?
I'd say not all scandals are character assassination driven, but of course, scandals can lead to character assassination. For instance, if a politician is scandalized, the opposition would maybe point at his character and say, this is an evil guy, he always was an evil guy, yeah, he's crooked, I don't know. So this can be, character assassination can be an outcome of a scandal process, or also an instrument, I think, in the scandalization process, in the scandal clock, for example.
Yeah, exactly, because it mirrors these kind of roles or types that scandalizers and scandalized take, right? And we have to take into account that not all scandals have this individual component, right? So, for instance, there are scandals like the Panama Papers or the Pandora Papers, all these large financial scandals really going on a global scale that lack this individual component where you cannot really pin it down to, I mean, you can, but it's seldomly done that you have these individual culprits there whose character would then be questions or whose reputation could be destroyed. Rather, those scandals run on a more abstract level, right? And that is that can be a problem, because those scandals, even though they make huge waves because they are outrageous, really, they are really outrageous forms of misconduct and transgressions, and something that should actually get us all on the barricades, really. But it doesn't.
Yeah.
And the reason why it doesn't is that it's lacking this individual component that is so central to, for instance, character assassination.
Yeah, absolutely. The Panama Papers are so interesting. It was a huge scandal in the beginning. Every media outlet reported about that for some days, maybe 2 weeks. And afterwards, in Germany, for instance, what I witnessed, only the Süddeutsche Zeitung was reporting again and again and again for a longer time. Of course, they were the leading journalists in the investigation, but it shows us that these scandal complexes are not so easily to put it down to one person or one group of person, or to personalize the allegations. And that's a major point in scandal research, I think.
I appreciate that, because certainly when we talk about character assassination, we're looking at something that, as you mentioned, is quite personalized, related to an individual figure who has behaved often inappropriately. And as Martin points out in the chat, as we approach character assassination, we're looking at an intentional communication campaign to destroy someone's reputation. And it certainly can be the case that scandals can happen by accident. So we have reached the end of my prepared questions for our wonderful guests today, but you all have some great questions that I'm going to shift to asking now. And I'm going to maybe attempt to keep this organized, but we'll see how that goes. But nonetheless, keep chiming in the chat if you have other questions you'd like us to ask our esteemed scandologists. And so one question that we've gotten is about the idea of context. And so we talked about recently the role of maybe a German corporate culture compared to a United States corporate culture. And so does the consideration of context as a key variable here challenge this three-step definition that you've provided us at the beginning?
I don't know if I understand the question correctly. But too many.
Let me add my take on it then, right? So the first step that you've identified is that there is some type of transgression of norms that occurs. Now, certainly it's the case, as you all have identified, that different cultures have very different norms, whether it's a moral code or a law, as you identify, that they would consider able to be transgressed. And so does kind of considering these different transgressions kind of blow up your definition of scandal? Or maybe another way of asking it is, are there some common themes in these moral codes that get transgressed?
Okay, very good question. That's the reason why we are working on that framework. We showed last year at the conference, at the CREA conference. We proposed that to look at 3 levels: the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level, when we look at scandal cases in different nations, for example. So we have on the macro level different media systems, more or free media systems, more or less internet, political system, legal system, religion, overall culture, maybe also other factors like popular culture and so on. On the meso level, we look at the corporate culture or the culture in parties. And on a micro level, we look at recipients, scandalized persons, and possible scandalizers. And then we see differences. For instance, if we look at, and these are typical examples we see in the literature, if we look at sex scandals, politicians betraying their wives or the other way around, in Southern Europe, just look at Italy, the cases of Berlusconi were not that scandalized like they would have been scandalized in the US, because in the US it's a very important factor that you're a good husband or a good wife, you go to church, or you have children. It's a very important factor to become president or to get another office. And this is interesting. We had some cases in Germany when it comes to sex and politics, but they were not scandalized in a way that they had to resign or something like this. There was there's a long tradition in German political journalism to keep the private life out of the coverage, except the politician uses his family or her family to promote herself or himself. That's the exception. In the US, we have more investigative journalism, of course, on the private life. So these are differences on the macro level when it comes to the journalistic culture, the media system.
Also related to the legal system, obviously, because in the United States, journalists have totally different leverage on how they can use specific information they gained and how they can use this kind of keyhole approach to journalism. Wouldn't be thinkable in Germany through the journalistic culture as well. And I think the United States have many examples where transgressions, as André said, that wouldn't really cause that much outrage in Germany, killed political careers in the United States. I mean, notwithstanding, obviously, your last president who broke many moral, legal, and just general codes of proper presidential behavior, or even human. I wouldn't get too far, sorry, to that. But I mean, this whole concept that we presented here is kind of questioned again, because there are certain political actors that evade this whole concept of being scandalized. And I think, Martin, you raised this question earlier in the chat as regards populist communication, right? Because in an age of populism, we have to wonder if these logics and those kind of safeguards that scandalization processes offer society, the stabilization component I mentioned in the very beginning, if those safeguards aren't destroyed by now through populist rhetoric, through populist communication, and through this age of post-shame that comes with populist communication. I mean, they just don't care. It doesn't stick to them. It doesn't really, and their following, their followers, the people who vote for them, they don't care either. They look the other way. And that
true,
was
and
mind-boggling. It is.
And it fits to populist communication strategies. If
Yeah,
a
we
populist
have
politician is
we have a
scandalized,
populist politician in the Netherlands right now who says scandalization is our modus vivendi. We are deliberately out to trigger scandals because that's how we generate publicity, and we're not even bashful about it. We just admit it.
And
Totally.
if there are some soft scandals, for example, a newspaper criticizing a politician because of some tweets, or I don't know, it fits to the populist rhetoric, because he or she could say, see, people, the elites try to harm me and harm you because I'm your voice. So it fits to the populist style of communication.
That's a really interesting point. And certainly in our work on character assassination, we've looked into Teflon politicians, you know, things just slide off of them. None of the allegations of character flaws really stick to them. But we got a couple of questions in the chat about, I think, something that relates to a populist communication style, but the idea of manufacturing scandals. And so if folks are curious if scandals that are sort of manufactured or maybe fit into what you've been calling soft scandals, André, do manufactured scandals play out differently than quote unquote real scandals, or are we still mostly considering the same dynamics of, you know, the audience of people paying attention, broadening, or are there really different dynamics here?
It's an interesting question, because I can remember Hans Matthias Kepling at our conference, and he tried to make arguments against the functionalist view on scandals. He said we can see that some journalists scandalize the same topics over and over again. They might have an agenda. I would second that to some degree. So yeah, I think it also depends on the recipients, because on their standpoints, on their worldviews. For example, if a politician of a party scandalized I like, or I vote for, I would maybe, if the scandal topic is not too high, you know, when it comes to tax scandals or something like that, I'd say, oh, they're trying to harm my movement or my party or my worldview. So I think the recipient's perspective is also extremely important to look at.
And I think it makes those manufactured scandals really hard to forecast how they will play out, because after all, we are living in a highly polarized public climate, where one part of the population seems to resort to their set of facts, and the other part of the population seems to resort to their own set of. So we are living in one society, but seemingly in two worlds increasingly. Yeah, and that obviously can be explained by psychological theories or models of selective exposure. For instance, the American media system is a great example how selective exposure can work. If you look at you are highly biased and polarized, especially broadcast journalism, but also obviously a hyper-partisan alternative media, and selective perception, because as I said, we live in a high choice media environment, and people choose what kind of information they are consuming, which kind of information they receive. And if this information is, well, part of this channel that really lashes out on these manufactured scandals, and I think Fox News is a great example where we see one manufactured scandal after another on a regular basis, well, then it sticks, and it simulates this intensifying phase. And then once we are in this intensifying phase of public communication about a manufactured transgression or something real, well, then we are in the phase where it needs to have consequences at some point, where people, even though they are falsely attacked by something, or if the attack is really just, excuse my French, bullshit, it's still something where they have to legitimize themselves, where they have to ponder publicly what consequences this can have. So it's really something where we're entering the field of propaganda as well.
I'm going to ask two more quick questions, and then actually, I don't know if they'll be quick, but I encourage you to think about being brief in your answer since it's noon now. But two more great questions that were in the chat that I want us to hit quickly, and then we'll wrap up here. But the next one is about the rehabilitation phase that you mentioned as potentially part of a scandal clock. And so Leah asked about this, and Jacob mentioned Andrew Cuomo, who was a beloved politician here at the start of the pandemic and has since fallen out of grace for sexual harassment accusations. But so can you talk a little bit about the rehabilitation process or recovering from a scandal? How long might it take? Are there various things that politicians or others who have been scandalized can do to rehabilitate their image?
I've got an easy answer, because in Burkhardt's theory, he says rehabilitation phase is over when the scandalized actor is back in office, or is back in his social system and can act in a normal way. That would be the most easiest answer.
Sure.
But you have to look at the topic of the scandal, of course. If it is about a tax scandal or something like that, many people forgive politicians or celebrities. For example, we had a tax scandal, a huge tax scandal on German football manager Uli Hoeneß, the most famous football manager maybe in Europe. And he went to prison, he got out, and I think the rehab is over, because now he's back at FC Bayern Munich, working there, consulting them and so on. He's on television. So this thing is over. When it comes to much more harder scandals, for example, child abuse or rape, or if people get harmed or killed, I think it's impossible to come back if you're a public person. That's kind of normal, yeah, because people differentiate between the harm.
I agree with André. I think we really have to make a hierarchy of norms. I mean, there are some norms that are really trans-cultural and internationally accepted, like murder, for instance. And if those norms or moral codes are violated, obviously there's not much chance for redemption. On the other hand, the example of Uli Hoeneß, the football manager, is interesting because he also redeemed himself by presenting himself as, reflecting on something and acknowledging what he did wrong, and also saying how tax evasion was something really wrong. And so he made the public case for himself, where he learned something out of it. Yeah. And there again, we have this stabilizing mechanism of scandals, because you have the scandalized who then goes public, because especially if they are well-known public figures, they go public and they say, well, I learned something, I'm a better person now, and this what I did is so wrong. And this obviously, once a public figure does this stabilizes the norm further, and maybe also changes public sentiment about something like tax evasion. So once you do that, there is a good chance for redemption, but not in all cases, obviously.
Yeah. On the other side, another case, a different case would be the Gutenberg Affair, where he plagiarized whole parts of his book, of his dissertation. He copied whole parts of other books into his dissertation. Really stupid. He had to resign. But in his resigning speech, he only talked about he made mistakes. Every person makes mistakes. Yeah, sure, that's normal. But until now, he never said he betrayed on purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think for most people, most people would say, okay, he could get back into office because the topic is too complex. Not everybody is a scientist or scholar. Not everybody understands what happened there. But concerning the scientific field in Germany, I'm pretty sure 90% or more would answer in a survey that he cannot resign.
There's a lot of important, I think, and interesting things in the examples that you just brought up. There's a lot of research in my field of rhetoric that concerns the public apology and how to craft an effective and credible public apology. And we've written a little bit about that in some of our work as well. But I think you've certainly pointed to, when it comes to thinking about rehabilitation, the idea of you know, how high in the hierarchy is the norm that's been violated? And, you know, is the norm that's been violated something that's in the prominent public eye? And for something like plagiarism on an academic level, maybe not strong enoughly prominent for that to prevent rehabilitation. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap us up here. And I like this question because I think it gets at, again, some different aspects than things that we at CARP Lab tend to study. But so bearing in mind different leaks that have occurred recently from WikiLeaks sort of onward and some of the newer ones as well, does public outrage tend to differ when the norm transgression involves an individual versus an institution, the state, the government, that kind of thing? How does public outrage tend to play out when we have an individual target versus an institutional one?
Yeah, I think I mean, I touched on that in one of my earlier answers already, but I think it is something that we have to acknowledge, that once we have an individual target, it's much easier to tell or to unfold this narrative of scandalization. There's a really interesting study on investigative journalism in the United States by journalism scholar, I think James O'Coin, who talked about the moral engagement of investigative journalists. And he pointed out that the moral engagement of investigative journalists historically, for instance, at the turn of the 20th century, the famous muckrakers, which was much more present. So journalists took a stance, identified culprits, and really individualized or personalized their story, while modern investigative journalism, think of even the era of the Watergate scandal, the Pentagon Papers, and nowadays the Panama Papers and so on. They operate on a more abstract level because they are constrained by the objectivity principles of journalism that dictate kind of an unbiased, unpersonal, neutral stance. And that makes it harder to scandalize if you don't have a scandalizer who enters the whole of the public hero, like for instance, the muckrakers at the turn of the 20th century. Think of Jacob Riis, think of Lincoln Steffens, and all these famous journalists, or H.L. Mencken. Yeah, so these people really positioned themselves from a journalistic perspective, yeah, so to speak, as the custodians of conscience of society, right? And that worked well to like really put some scandals in the public consciousness, while today it seems to be much harder from this abstract objective level to report on scandals.
Yeah. And I think this is also a threat because nowadays we have other journalists alike, individuals, yeah, on digital media, for example, influencers and other people, bloggers. We see that right now in Germany in the vaccination debate. There are huge Telegram channels and also blogs working on this myth that there is a conspiracy against the people by the government, the pharma industry, big pharma is the term. I think that could influence the feelings or the behavior of some people who are already polarized. We know that from studies that polarized persons are more vulnerable for such communicative acts.
Thank you for your thoughts on those, and for those of you that are also chiming in about this conversation and with great examples in the chat. I wish that we could keep talking about this for 2 more hours because this has been a really wonderful conversation, and it's been, again, lovely to see some folks that we know for many years working with CARP Lab, and some new folks in Scandalogy Research as well. I have a couple of quick announcements for us as we wrap up here that I hope will be relevant to your continued engagement with these research topics and may hopefully help you push forward some of your own work as well. As I mentioned, the Scandalogy Research Initiative is hosting a conference at the University of Bamberg, and I have screenshotted from their website the call for papers that you can, I'm not going to read it to you, but it's there for you. And it is my sincere hope that someone is pasting the link in the chat. But again, the topic for this conference is political scandals in the age of populism, partisanship, and polarization. Certainly relevant to a lot of the conversations that we have had today. So if your research overlaps with those topics, please consider submitting a paper. And I hope that someone can put in the chat, since I realized I didn't grab it in my screenshot here, what the
put
deadline.
The link in the chat.
Excellent.
I just did, yeah.
Yes, excellent. So the link is there in the chat for you, and someone else tell me in the chat what the deadline is for submitting your abstracts as well. And then I have one more announcement for you all, Scandalogy and CARP Lab folks, is that we're actually having another webinar next Friday, same time, looking at character assassination, scandals, and crisis management. And for this conversation, we're really, really excited to welcome Tim Coombs of Texas A&M University. And for those of you that are in the fields of communication studies, crisis management, and public relations, you absolutely know Tim Coombs's work. And Tim Coombs has the honor too of being one of the few people that has contributed both to some of our volumes on character assassination and to the volumes on Scandology. So his work certainly overlaps with both scandals and character assassination. And so he's going to have a conversation with us next Friday, February 18th. And I'm assuming, since I'm seeing things in the chat, that the Eventbrite link to register for that conversation to join us is being circulated to you all. So we hope to see many of you again next Friday. And then I promise we won't ask for your time the Friday after that as well. But we are so, so grateful for your great questions and the wonderful conversation that we've had today. And again, sort of the impetus for this conversation is continuing to pull together and putting in conversation the work that we have been doing along with you all on character assassination and the work that the folks at the Scandalogy Research Initiative have been doing as well. So now you know André and Hendrik who are doing that work, and maybe those of you that have come over to join us today from that side of research now know us at CARP Lab, including me, Martin, Sergey, and Eric. And so I'll close us out this Friday just by saying thank you for a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for spending 75 minutes with us and asking your great questions. And oh, I was supposed to say mailing list. Sorry, there was one other thing. We at CARP Lab have a mailing list that keeps folks updated on our goings on, and the Scandalogy Research Initiative does as well. So my people, if you can post how to join those mailing lists in the chat here. And of course, you can get a lot of information about what we at CARP Lab and our friends at Scandalogy are up to by following us on Twitter at @carp_lab. So I will wrap it up there, other than just to say thank you as well. And good luck with all of the work that you are doing. For those of you that are academics, have a wonderful rest of your semester. And we hope to see many of you again next Friday. Thank you.